Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's Chief Learning Officer webinar, sponsored by Abilitie. I hope everyone's having a great start to their week and excited as I am for today's webcast, how the metaverse is transforming cohort-based learning. My name is Steve, and as always, I'll be working in the background here to help answer any general or technical questions you may have. Before we get started, though, I want to go over a few key reminders. First, all audio will be streamed through your speakers or headphones, so please adjust your volume there accordingly. If you have any questions or experiencing any technical issues throughout this webcast today, go ahead and click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a technical question, the answer will appear here. Any content-related questions for our speakers today will be read at the end if time allows. Don't forget, you can chat with your fellow attendees by joining the live attendee chat. And finally, you will receive a link to the recording of this webinar, along with the certification codes for this webcast in a follow-up email. So please allow at least 24 hours after the conclusion of the event before this information is sent. And now at this time, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. First up, we have Karl Kapp, Professor of Instructional Technology and Director of the Institute for Interactive Technologies at Bloomsburg University. And next we have Luke Owings, VP of Product over there at Abilitie. And I believe Luke's going to go ahead and get us started. So Luke, take it away.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. And Karl, I can see your thumbs up. It is awesome to see so many familiar names in the attendee list. Looks like we have a couple hundred people here, Karl. It's always nice to see you on a Thursday and to get going on this. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. And so I'll introduce myself and get it going. I'd also love if you guys can continue doing what you have in the chat. Throw in your location, showing where you're coming from. I see people from Austin, from East Tennessee, from Malaysia, from Virginia, from Vermont, from Saudi Arabia, DC, Montreal. Karl, they're coming from everywhere.
Yeah, fantastic.
We are going to have some fun today. Awesome. Beautiful. El Paso, New Jersey, Los Angeles, Germany. It's got to be late over there. Denver, Colorado. I hope they got snow. Dusseldorf. Love it. Karl and I will be managing the chat. We'll be watching it throughout. So feel free to throw thoughts in there. Feel free to throw ideas in there. We'll try to respond to it as we can, and we'll talk through this. As I told you, my name is Luke Owings. I'm the VP of Product at Abilitie, where we run leadership development programs for corporate clients. We started as a simulation company. And so we started as building games for learning, building games in the mini MBA mold. So think about building finance, management, strategy, strategic leadership, where we were putting people in immersive environments and causing them to actually go into the social state of learning and go into the state of having to have a challenge to learn through. As part of that, we started to work in the metaverse in the last year. And of our 35,000 learners last year, we had a couple hundred that we were exploring for the first time in the metaverse. And I will say that as the head of product, I get to push our products forward. I get to push forward our learning. And I am a bit of a pedagogy dweeb, a bit of a pedagogy nerd, if you will say. And I know many of them in the audience are as well. And in doing that, I've had the privilege of working with Karl a little bit and actually reading some of his stuff, actually having him push us forward on this. And so I will say I'm going to be a bit of a fanboy during this webinar and say that Karl literally wrote the book on gamification. He literally wrote the book on the metaverse, right? And so, Karl, I'll let you introduce yourself, but I will say I'm really excited to be here with you, to hear some of your thoughts on where learning is happening in the metaverse, why it's different this time, what the metaverse is, right? How we're seeing it show up in corporate learning environments, how we're seeing it show up in cohort-based education, and then just some principles that we're going forward with. And I'll share what we're seeing on the Abilitie side. So, Karl, let me hand it over to you and introduce yourself.
Great, fantastic, great to be here, Luke. Great to be see so many excited people and some familiar names, and very excited that everyone can make it today. So my name is Karl Kapp. I'm a professor of instructional technology at Bloomsburg University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. We've now become Commonwealth University. We merged with a couple of our sister organizations. And my focus throughout my career has been on the design, development, and delivery of online learning, specifically in the area of games and gamification. But over 10 years ago, I became really interested in this thing called the metaverse, or virtual worlds. Second Life was one of the tools back then, Thinking Worlds and some other tools as well. And my colleague, Tony O'Driscoll, and I put together a book called Learning in 3D, which we explored different learning archetypes, different ways of working in 3D. And the reason was because my first time in the virtual world was like really disappointing. So I walked in. So I walked into a classroom on English as a second language. And first of all, it's weird because English is my first and as a typical American only language. And I walk in and there's a virtual PowerPoint and a virtual seat, and I sat and virtually watched a classroom presentation. And I thought, what a waste. Why not have me try to order a meal? Why not have me book a hotel? Why not have me on the street trying to get transportation? And I thought this wonderful environment is wasted on virtual PowerPoint. So now fast forward, things have changed. I was telling Luke before in my graduate school, they were talking helmets were virtual reality helmets on here. And now we've got cardboard and we've got our phones. So things have changed and evolved to where it's not technologically difficult or an outliner to go ahead and be in a virtual 3D environment. We can now do that very easily with the technology, Luke. So I know you guys are using it in some of the things that you're doing, and it's just exciting to see that move forward. I used to joke that the day that my book Learning in 3D came out was pretty much the day that Second Life crashed, right? Like it was at the top of the hype cycle and everybody was in, and it was on NBC, the Today Show, and then like the next day it was gone. But it hasn't gone away. People are still using it and developing it and working in it and learning from it. And then all of a sudden, when Mark got the idea that he was going to rename his company Meta, it just took off.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many different things there. And from what I understand, Karl, there are still people in Second Life, and there are still people who actually have concerts in Second Life, do all these things. If you're in Second Life, just put in the chat, hey, I'm in Second Life, and maybe you all can find each other. I don't know exactly how big that metaverse is right now, but it's a fascinating place. I also do want to just answer the questions and say this will be recorded and it will be sent out, and so everyone will get that. Karl, you talked a little bit about kind of the technical changes from back then. And if we go back 15 years, right, Second Life was a bit clunky, right? It was existing, there were places to go around. Now, the technology has just gone so far beyond there. It's gotten cheaper, it's gotten better, it's reduced latency, right? It's done all of these different things. As importantly, though, I mean, I think socially, the world has changed. And I think back to 3 years ago for many of us, just under 3 years ago when the pandemic started, right? I was at that point at McKinsey and I was leading a lot of executive leadership development programs for corporations, for their top leaders. And there was, in January, a feeling that a lot of that stuff couldn't be virtual. And then in March, there was a sense that it was inevitable, it had to be virtual. And then over the course of the next 12 months, there was this scramble to put things that were not virtual into virtual and to recreate them exactly the same. And I love your story about Second Life, right? Because in Second Life, for those of you who don't know, it's a metaverse environment where you have an avatar that works around and you actually have almost like a second life that you're managing and that you're interacting with others. And we'll define metaverse in a second here. But there was this process where it got put, things that were in person just got put online in the exact same way they were. They created English as a second language courses in a fake conference room. And I always think of that dystopian thing Zuckerberg did, where he said, wouldn't it be so cool if you were in Horizon Worlds at a conference room doing a meeting? And I was like, that sucks. That's terrible. I do not want to do that at all.
With no legs.
With no legs. I prefer having my legs. But socially, the world changed. Right? The world changed in 2020, and there was this scramble to make it virtual. And I think what we've seen in the last year is that now with the push to return to office, it's that something was missing when we went straight virtual. Something was missing. And we're starting to learn how to do it better. And so I think the answer that's coming up is all of those amazing things about virtual, all of those amazing things about accessibility, all those amazing things about being able to zoom in and out with different people from around the world. You and I are in a different place and having a conversation today, now can be crafted specifically for the virtual world. And that to me is where the metaverse is coming up more than anything, right? And maybe for the group and for me, you could just define, what do we mean by the metaverse? Because in my mind, it's one of the first virtually native environments that is actually making use of the technological, social, and cultural changes that are happening.
Yeah, that's a really it's a really interesting question. So one other thing I want to my co-author Tony O'Driscoll, when we wrote the book Learning in 3D, talked about this thing called routinization, which basically means we tend to, with the new technology, do what we could do in the old technology. So for example, when the motion picture first came out, they took a camera and filmed plays. And that was what they did with the motion camera. But now we are able to do things like, so for example, when we see a blur on the screen, we know it's a time shift. When we see whirling around, we know we're going to end up somewhere else. So now films have their own literary elements that help us understand what's going on that maybe don't exist anywhere else. So when we take the look at the metaverse, we started out with the metaverse as being Neil Stephenson in 1992 in Snow Crash defined it as basically a perpetual world that's digital that continues on and on. And the main difference, even back then, there were arguments, is Second Life a metaverse or is it not a metaverse? Technically, I guess, because you couldn't go from one place to another, one product to another, it wasn't. But then when Mark Zuckerberg said, okay, we're going to call Meta, like a weird thing happened to me. It was kind of like this black hole of, oh, we're a company over here and we're doing AI. Oh, that's part of the metaverse. Oh, we're blockchain. Oh, that's part of a metaverse. Oh, we're NFTs. That's part of them. And then all of a sudden, all these things came into being the metaverse. I even read an article said, oh, the metaverse isn't a thing. It's a concept. And I thought, well, as an L&D professional, if it's a concept, like how's that going to help me? How's that practical of what I need to do? So if we go to the practical aspect of the metaverse is a 3D virtual environment. It might run a blockchain, it might not run a blockchain, where people can get together and interact in a space that is a proxy for a physical space. And the beauty of that proxy is it doesn't have to be an office. It doesn't have to be a park. The space can be a molecule. The space could be on another planet. The space could be 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So we're actually creating this perpetual environment that allows people to identify with where they are and what they're doing and how they can interact. And to me, that's the metaverse. So all these other things that came into the metaverse are important, are tangential, but the real heart of it is this environment where we can go, get together and spend time together. And Luke, we were talking about before how it's almost more real than using Zoom. So when you think about Zoom, it's very unnatural. So you can see my face very close up. If we were having a face-to-face conversation, chances are you wouldn't be this close to me all of the time for the whole conversation. But if you go into and become an avatar and walk around the virtual space, you'll notice, and there's been a bunch of research out of the Stanford lab on Second Life and other areas where people keep their same social distance. So Europeans are actually closer in Second Life and virtual worlds than Americans. We like to stand much further away from each other. I don't know why, except for the pandemic, and then we don't wear masks and we don't. But anyway, so the really interesting thing is it more accurately represents what we're doing in a physical space than something like Zoom. And the other thing about Zoom is you can't see my whole body. And even unconsciously, we're like a little bit worried about that. Like, what's he doing with his hands? What's going on? So all of these things that we take as natural, like more natural because we're in Zoom, is not the case. The virtual environment is actually more of a realistic, more of a comfortable place to be than interacting on Zoom or not just Zoom, Teams or any of those environments. And once, again, the other thing about the metaverse, which I thought was weird, is a step backwards. Like Second Life people had legs. Like
Yeah.
I mean, they have legs now in Horizon, but it just
Yeah.
blew my mind. Like, how can you go so far backwards? And they were very much in the uncanny valley. But right now we've got the technology and the tools to Luke, to your point, that allow us to be much more realistic, much more subtle than we could ever be, 20 years ago.
100%, 100%. It's fascinating because you didn't even get into the whole thing where on Zoom, I'm watching myself half the time.
Yeah.
And that's like scares me. And Melissa's talking about her hair. I'm worried about my hair over here, Melissa. Me and Karl over here are worried about how we look in it. When you say that, I always boil it down to three things, right? The metaverse is immersive, it's persistent, and it's social, right? So it's this environment that's immersive. It's actually, we're in it all the time when you actually log in, and it's around you, and it's things that you can interact with and actually move your avatar to interact with in these ways, right? That immersive thing is really important to it because Zoom definitionally is not immersive, right? It's like you're almost looking at a window into it. So it's immersive and it surrounds you. It's persistent, so it continues without you, right? It has memory. I always love when we look at metaverse type environments, and we have a campus that we're doing, and I will show you all later. When you have this metaverse environment, it's persistent, so it's there when you're not there. And so changes that people make to it stick around, and that spatial orientation that you're talking about, Karl, I think shows up time and time again.
Yeah,
and then it's social. It's a place to meet people, right? And I think that this is really important for where we're going with this conversation. And so to give you all in the audience a roadmap for where Karl and I want to go is, if this is the metaverse, and it wouldn't be 2023 if we didn't maybe bring up ChatGPT at some point, Karl. We'll see what we can do, and ChatGPT can actually show up in our NPC world of metaverse type things. But like, if this is the metaverse, this immersive, persistent social environment that Karl is explaining, we want to share some examples of where we're seeing it used in training, where we're seeing it used in leadership development and learning development, and then talk through some of the principles that we're seeing there and why it's so powerful, right? And why it's so powerful. And the broader frame that I want to give here as we dive into this again, Karl, is, at Abilitie, we lead these leadership development programs. And I actually see some of our clients in here, which is awesome to see. Wonderful to see you all. With these leadership development programs, we as professionals in the L&D field are being asked to do more and more. We're being asked to not just build skills, we're asking to reskill. We're asking to reskill in new environments that people have never been in. We're being asked to build connections among employees, right? There was this huge worry about the Great Resignation. And then there was this huge worry about actually creating employee networks, even though people are all around the world and they're more spread out than ever before. And some companies are coming back, but some are not. And there's this huge push for training and learning and development and leadership development in particular to build culture of organizations in increasingly dispersed places. And I think the thesis I want to put forward, and Karl, have you explore with me, is that the metaverse is a virtual native environment that allows for that creation of skills, connections, and culture in a way that actually is to the level as it had in person, and is a step forward in the next couple of years. And you already see this, and I always come back to this this famous quote, and I wrote it down over here, so I'll have it, which is that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And we're seeing this stuff already, right? We're seeing this stuff. And Karl, maybe I'll set you up and have you talk a few things about some of the really interesting training usages you're already seeing in the metaverse.
Yeah. So to address Jesse's point, so it's really interesting. There's a couple of things. So Jesse talks about how, and Clark talks about how the metaverse or virtual reality can be distracting. Absolutely, but so can a regular classroom. So can an e-learning module, right? If it's not designed correctly. So we need to use these tools for the right outcomes. So if we decide that we're going to lecture in a virtual world, in a metaverse environment, we're wasting our time. But if we are going to say, look, we're going to immerse you in an emergency situation and you have to react accordingly and you have to coordinate with someone else, then that reinforces those learning objectives that you want in terms of collaboration and working together. So that's really kind of important, and something that needs to be thought of. I talk about different, we'll talk about this later, but different structures that make most sense in the metaverse. And
Mhm.
then to talk to Lee's question, onboarding is super important, Enan, to your point. But the one thing I think that we have that, like Second Life, you had people running their characters around in circles, and you had people are much more comfortable with using the technology in general than they were before. So it's not 100%, but there's definitely a learning curve that isn't quite as steep as it was in Second Life. And then Lee asked about, is it being used in other places? I can tell you that there has been the virtual world, best practice in virtual world conference has been held in Second Life for at least a decade. So there are conferences going on and everything. And Luke, to your point, the future is already here. You just have to find the right pockets of it and leverage that. That's why the meta launch I thought was like just a little bit weird. Like they didn't seem to learn from history. But the idea is that we can leverage these technologies to answer these questions that we're talking about and to do things like respond to a virtual incident, do things like having a conference, doing those kind of items. And Luke, I think I totally blew off your question.
That's
So
no
do you
problem
want
at
to
all.
like circle back around because I forget what it was?
I mean, we're doing so many interesting things here, and I see great questions coming in the chat, and a lot of them are around onboarding to the platform. I see some questions around, hey, how do we do that? And Karl, you're talking about that there. I see some comments about things like icebreakers, right? I see comments about that. I think one thing that we learned from the gaming world is that the idea of a tutorial, the idea of a way to actually engage with that world in your own way and actually act in that way is really powerful. I personally see it from as little as like my 8-year-old nephew when he started playing Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which is this immersive video game, and how it tutorialized him through. And then 2 days later, he couldn't stop talking about it and he learned more. I still say this, at the beginning of the pandemic, he learned more from that video game than he did from the Zoom meetings he was on for that 2-3 weeks of the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. He had the motivation to read. He started to learn how to do math. He started to learn how to do all these different things. And I was just amazed that this environment that was so immersive, that onboarded him, that created space for him, actually allowed him to do things and learn new things. I think you've had some examples that you've shared with me about types of environments that have done similar things, whether it's environments that allow you in the metaverse to actually engage with learning in a new way, engage with something that you couldn't in the real world. You've also talked about ones that are more kind of make use of the space of the metaverse. Why don't we start with that first group and really start with that first group of, you've talked about volcanoes, you've talked about coral reefs, Karl, you've talked about going into the human body. Pick your favorite one and talk about how the metaverse enables it.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So I'm going to answer that question, but I just want to. So the one thing that you mentioned, Luke, I think that is very important is video games have figured out how to onboard people.
Absolutely.
And that's something that L&D, like somehow we kind of lose our mind or don't really understand how to onboard people. And we have to think it's this big complicated element. But if you think about a video game, the first thing it does when I get in, it goes, run your character from point A to point B. Here's how you do that. And then I run my character. And then it says, okay, now jump. Okay, now aim the weapon. Okay, now do. So we really need to, we say, oh, onboarding's the people won't do it because it's onboarding. That's on us. We need to do the onboarding the right way so that it can be successful. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. The other thing is, somebody talks about how's it translate into real life? There's actually studies that show actions and behaviors in Second Life actually for a little while were transferred to real life. So people acting like a hero in Second Life made them do more heroic acts when they got out of that environment. So that I think is really kind of interesting. So there's a lot we don't know, but we can go back. I mean, there's research about virtual worlds and what happens when you do that. Now, that other interesting thing is we can go anywhere and do anything. So for example, we can take, if we're teaching, for example, medical science, or pharmaceutical training or whatever, we can take somebody and shrink them to the size of a molecule and have them injected into the human body and see what it's like. What does a clogged artery look like? And with the technology, by the way, not just a clogged artery, you can see, Karl, your clogged artery. right? This is the inside of you. This is an image from what we've taken. We've digitized it, and now you can see exactly what it looks like. You can see exactly what that tumor looks like. You can see exactly what your insulin and I mean, all of that kind of stuff, which I think is fascinating. The other fascinating thing, there was a virtual world that they used to train. This I just thought was so interesting, to train first responders how to work together, because when there's an accident on a highway, the longer the backup, the more likely there is a secondary and worse accident. But if you think of like a corridor, you have your local responders, you maybe have the state police, you maybe have these municipalities who haven't worked together before. So how do you do this training? Well, if you do it physically, it's really expensive to get all the trucks there and all the people. So they coordinated and practiced virtual coordination of accident scenes. And to me, I thought that was such a good use, because you could feel the tension of, the traffic flow stopping and people getting, kind of upset. You could see the speed that you wanted to do that, but you could also see, hey, we call it this. Oh, we call it that. Okay, well, that little thing that we call something different has just caused us 15 minutes of misunderstanding. And so those types of training environments, because you have the spatial element, everybody can look behind and see the car on fire. It's not like, imagine there's a car on fire, right? So it provides those types of environments. So I think, to me, those are kind of the exciting ones. The other one I talk about is I always joke around. I'm like, you could never walk into the middle of a tsunami and investigate it. One of my students in my classes go, yeah, Dr. Kapp, you could do that once. I'm like, yeah, but
just once.
Just one time. I'd kind of like to live to tell the tale. So I don't know if that student was implying something or whatever, but the idea is that we could have these dangerous experiences and we could learn a lot from them, and then we can apply those to making people safer, making people more if we switch it to a factory environment, more productive.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of things that we can do that we don't do. And the metaphor we need to use, I think, for the metaverse is a field trip, right? We're not creating a classroom instructional experience. We're creating a field trip. And if you think that way, it kind of changes the design.
I love that field trip analogy, and I want to take to it from something that's in the chat here, Karl. I do want to share that, one of the big things we're saying is that video games are something to be learned from. My favorite video game is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, bar none. Go ahead and type in the chat what your favorite video game is, because I know we got people from the 70s, from the 60s, from the 80s, from the 90s. We might even have some of the TikTok generation here, who maybe it's Candy Crush. I see Resident Evil, I see Skyrim. One of the most important things we've learned is it's okay to learn from these things. They're doing incredible stuff. And I'll say at Abilitie, we learn from them all the time. Our simulations are an immersive environment to learn finance and to learn to be an executive, to learn to be a manager, right? But we've learned, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. I freaking love that. Solitaire, Marianne, you're taking the piss out of me, I think, over there. But maybe it's Solitaire. That's very cool. Maybe it's Minecraft over there. But one of the first things I want to say is these are things to learn from, right? I also saw a ton of comments in here about Magic School Bus. Yeah, Karl, do you remember Magic School Bus?
Yeah. Miss Grizzle.
Miss Grizzle. She was incredible.
She was amazing.
Talking about it.
Yeah.
It's actually available to us now. These things are available to us in the first time in an immersive way, where it's not us looking through a lens and doing it, but it's us actually exploring it and us actually being immersed in that environment. And it's kind of weird where, life imitates art, imitates life. And all of a sudden, the metaverse actually allows for some of these in exactly ones you've said.
Mm-hmm.
The last one I want to give it to, and I'll give it back to you, Karl, is we saw a lot of questions in here. Oh, I love this. Why do we still call them video games? Love it.
I don't know.
They are environments. And if you ever want to know what a good meeting looks like, I will say I've seen the best meetings run by 10-year-olds in Fortnite, as they're trying to decide how to coordinate with each other, how they're trying to decide how to build things together. Watch a Minecraft meeting of a bunch of 10-year-olds. Watch that and see how they organize themselves, see how they project plan. And I guarantee you, your company will learn something from that.
Yeah.
And so Go ahead.
No, so yeah, the colleague that I wrote the book with, Tony O'Driscoll, talked about World of Warcraft as the perfect leadership simulation, because you have a group of people that don't report to you, that you all have to work together, and the loot that you get in the end is not equal for everybody. So you've got to figure out how to divide it up. So there's a lot of lessons, and people always ask me, are video games, and why you call them is a good question, but are video games like the metaverse and what? And I think the thing that and somebody mentioned it here, that we can't lose sight of, is that people have already figured a lot of this out.
Yeah.
And so if we ignore what's happening in games, if we say, yeah, they're just games and they don't really, they're not serious. The Wii had a medical game where you actually would cut a person and, do stitches, and you would do it with and that kind of stuff. And it wasn't 100% accurate, but boy, it was not far off from things I've seen at, medical device companies. So with haptic responses and things like that. So the idea that this metaverse thing is totally new and we got to start from ground zero is not accurate. We can take a lot of those lessons from those individuals. So, and from Second Life. So somebody here asked, oh, how about diversity and inclusion? Well, I think it was Deloitte or Anderson, I can't remember, did a whole thing in Second Life where you could go take on different personas of different backgrounds and different experiences, and how NPCs reacted to you were slightly different based on what persona that you were taking on, and then how other people. So there's a great story about a woman who became the Kool-Aid character and went to different nightclubs as the Kool-Aid character. And she's like, I think it's kind of a metaphor, because at first people were like, yeah, that's really cool, the Kool-Aid character. And then this big characters trying to dance and bumping into people, and people get upset about that, and people get mad about it, and all of a sudden they weren't talking to the Kool-Aid character at all. And she's like, now I knew how it felt to be ostracized, right? So it's really kind of interesting how we can get these, and the experience is visceral, right? It's not like I'm reading about it. It's a visceral experience, and we know that visceral experiences translates into retention much longer than if we just kind of learn about it in a sterile environment. So that's another one of the advantages of these virtual worlds.
I think that's so right, Karl, right? And we're going to get into some of the deep stuff. We're going to go pedagogy nerd in a little bit. I do want to call out a few things that have been coming in the chat that are really important, right? Like, one is this immersion doesn't necessarily need the VR perspective, right? There are lots of ways to get there, and the technological cost has actually come way down over the years, whether it's things that you're engaging in a more video game atmosphere, using your keyboard and your computer, like we use with our GatherTown college always on virtual campus with some of our clients. It also has come down with things like cardboard in your phone. It's like shocking how cheap it can be in this world. So that immersion can happen in so many different ways, and we've seen it in these different ways. You talk about this visceral aspect to the immersion with the haptic responses and all that. I think the other place we see it training, and Karl, I think you and I were talking about this as well, is very empathy bringing, right? When you have an avatar, whether it's the Kool-Aid character or whether it's some other avatar that does not actually look like yourself, but it actually works with your self-expression, actually it can bring empathy to you in so many different ways. And we see this being used in diversity and inclusion training, right? We see this being used in diversity and inclusion training and doing role plays where we actually shift around what you're actually looking at and who you're actually showing up as. And we see it in healthcare. I know we have a lot of healthcare professionals here as well, right? In healthcare, we see it with doctors actually taking on the role of patients. And Karl, I'll give it to you so you can answer that cardboarding one live, because I think a lot of people are going to have that question. But like we see it in healthcare where, a doctor gets the experience of being a patient and gets to see what it's like when another doctor is talking to them like they were, right? And I think, you look at this visceral type of environment, you also look at this really empathy building type of environment, because inherently, and we're gonna spend a lot of time on this in the end, inherently the metaverse is social. Right? The metaverse is social, and it's something that you're engaging with other people, and you're engaging in the environment with as well. Karl, you want to talk about the cardboard thing? David's throwing stuff in there.
David's answering that question. Awesome. But basically, we can take our phone now, and we can take a little cardboard elements and having two screens, and it's as if you're in a virtual world, a metaverse world. In fact, working with one company, they have, it doesn't have to be, it can be your phone. They have a doctor's office where you hold your phone up, you click on a door, and you enter into a doctor's office that's not there. And you have a conversation with the doctor that's not there. And the cool thing is you can practice that wherever you happen to be. And so what it does is it breaks the four walls of the classroom and allows you to go wherever you want to, and allows you to have experiences in lots of different places. Now, the one thing I want to caution is, I mean, this is a presentation about the metaverse, so we're all, hopped up on the metaverse, but keep in mind that we as learning and development professionals have to use the right intervention for the right learning outcomes. So if we immediately say, oh, we need everything to be in the metaverse, we've done the wrong thing. We can't jump into the metaverse and assume that every L&D thing that we have is going to be solved by so for example, if I was teaching acronyms, jargon, and that kind of thing, I might not go to the metaverse. I might go to somewhere else. But if I'm teaching problem solving and coordinating at a high level, I might do that in the metaverse. So we as learning development professionals, it's our job to help, if we're fortunate enough, so for example, I had this large company and they wanted to do diversity and inclusion training, and they wanted to give everybody a headset and said, let's give everybody a headset. We'll immerse them as a different experience, and then we'll look at that. Yeah, that sounds really cool. But we said to them, well, just real quick, you have 100,000 people in your company, and at $500 a headset, and you haven't taught them anything. You've just bought them a headset, right?
50 million. I got it, Karl.
Right. Exactly.
50 million.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's not going to happen, right? So we can't jump at that, but we could do an interactive experience that you could do on your computer or on your phone that was not as deep, not as technologically required, but just as deep. So, and people say, well, it's not as immersive. Let me ask this question. Have you ever read a book and it made you cry? A book is black and white text, black text on a white background. Yet we're able to imbibe that with emotions, with feelings, with a sense of who we are and who we're talking to. So all of that kind of stuff, we don't need super immersion. We just need enough immersion to suspend our disbelief to jump into that environment. And we do that all the time. When we watch the movie Avatar, or when we watch the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we're suspending our disbelief to jump into that area. So all of that is possible and shows that we don't have to, put on the goggles. In fact, I think that if we think of the metaverse as a broader definition, the idea of augmented reality is going to leapfrog the virtual aspect of virtual reality, because people don't, when you put on goggles, you're isolated from other people. You can see them online, but like, who's behind me? What's going on when I'm not here? But if you have glasses that are projecting augmented reality, I think that's going to go a lot further. So if you haven't played Pokemon Go, if you haven't played the augmented reality game with Harry Potter, you need to download that and play that, because that's going to give you a glimpse of the future. And if you look into the entertainment industry, they're always slightly ahead of everybody else, because there's a lot more dollars there. And look to those folks and see what they're doing, and then adapt that to L&D needs and requirements. I think that's a good way to think about it.
I love that, Karl. And if I was in a webinar where the homework was to go play Pokemon Go, I would appreciate that. I think that's pretty fun. This AR versus VR is a really interesting piece. So far we've talked a lot about metaverse environments to allow you to do things that you couldn't do, right? This idea of going into the molecule, this idea of going into the tsunami more than once because you actually survive it that first time, right? This idea of also creating environments where you can engage with other people. You use the firefighting example, which I think is a really interesting one. I want to pivot it one step further, because and try to be very, very specific and tactical, because we have a lot of learning and development professionals here who lead leadership development courses. And they might be saying to themselves, like, okay, I'm leading a course on project management. I'm leading a course on finance, like we do. I'm leading a course on managing my team. How does the metaverse fit into those? And I want to share a few things that we're seeing at Abilitie and as part of some of the programs we're running, particularly with Invited MBA, and then let you build some of the design and the instructional infrastructure behind the scenes for us, Karl, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, we run multi-week leadership development programs that you can think of as mini MBAs, right? We run them with new hires. We run them with people who are becoming new managers. We run them with new executives. And what we see the metaverse do is allow in a virtual environment a whole set of things to be done that historically could only be done in person. Right? Allow people to actually develop community and culture. Allow over a period of time them to have a sense of place, an ability to self-express, which was really falling away in the Zoom world. Allow them to have an immersive and persistent space to come back to engage with each other. When we first built our environment, our learning and development environment for this, I think what was interesting to me was it started operating a little bit like a Starbucks. That third place where people would go and they would just sit in there and they would wait to engage with other people from their cohort. I specifically remember logging into our campus environment at 10 p.m. one night and seeing that Rob, one of our participants from Dubai, was sitting in there reading a case for a course that was happening in 2 days, just seeing if anybody else was reading the case to talk to. And I was like, man, this is really interesting. It's like a library. It's like a Starbucks. Say what you want about the We Crashed thing on HBO last year or on Apple TV, but the sense of community that WeWork had was something that was only existing in person. And this type of immersion didn't require much. And so I'm just going to show you a screenshot of what our campus environment looked like. This is going to be overwhelming to some of you who played Zelda in the 80s and played Pokemon in the 90s. It's going to look actually quite familiar. It's that type of two-dimensional environment. And we've talked a lot about 3D and immersive and headsets. So I want to show you that when we say metaverse, it can be really a basic environment. This is a two-dimensional environment where my avatar right there, Abilitie Luke, is standing in the middle, where we have a student lounge over here to the right, where people can come in, they can sit, they can actually read their cases, they can prepare themselves. We have stuff, we post them on the walls, things that they can see each other's projects, they can actually share and actually engage with them and each other in an immersive way. We post recordings up for them to see. We have classrooms for them to go to. We have a sense of space for them to continue coming back to. This was a campus environment that we created for our Invited MBA program last fall. And in the fall, it was, we had people from 15 different countries. And you can see those flags up here. And so we had this sense where they were actually seeing where each other came from and feeling ownership of what they were doing, right? And we were teaching them finance management and strategic leadership. And my point is that on top of those skills, they built a community, and the metaverse was the way to do it. And Karl, I think you've talked about designing in the metaverse. For those of you who would like to come see our campus, I'll tell you exactly how. Send in the chats if you're interested in seeing our campus, and I'll send an invite and I'll have some of my team there ready to see you. But what you've done for me and what you've helped me see is why that was happening, right? Because in the metaverse, you have these macro structures that are showing up, right? And you have these macro structures that make the learning great, right? So Karl, maybe you can talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so the idea, I actually have a LinkedIn learning course called Designing Learning for the Metaverse. So if anybody's interested in like kind of taking it to the next level, and you have access, most people have access to LinkedIn Learning through their library or whatever, there's really some interesting outcomes that you can think about from learning in the metaverse in that environment. And one of the things to think about is, what does it offer? Well, the metaverse offers a sense of being there. Oops, I'm not moving. A sense of being there. So that sense of being there gives us that sense of agency. So you and I, even though we're in the same place here on Zoom, if I said to everybody, hey, look to your left, whatever's on your left is a lot different than what's on my left. But if we're in a virtual environment, we're all looking at the same thing. So we have the same spatial knowledge and spatial information that is tied to our memory. And there's research that shows memory is tied to spatial relationships. So that makes a lot of sense. And then we also look at things like exploration. So some people, when you come into an environment, let's say that you're going to learn about safety in a factory, some people would want to explore all the elements of the factory. Other people would want to go step by step by step. But if you have created this factory, you can have dual purpose. So you can use it to explain to people what happens at each workstation, but you can also have people come in and build that community around a piece of equipment, for example. Oh, yeah, I used to work on one of these and it used to do this and used to do that. And now you have this solid anchor to connect people. And that's the connectedness element of the model. And the connectedness really allows and encourages people to make these social nuances and entrees and get to know people. That's why a physical class works really well, because we don't just share. We go in the space. We don't just share. Oh, we're only going to talk about learning. You know, we talk about our kids. We talk about our history. We talk about places that we've grown up, and you can do that as Luke said about the example of somebody just like waiting to talk about, you know, the instruction, and then finally this shared experience. One of the differences between novices and experts is that a novice will typically apply an algorithm to solving a problem. An expert will go through her Rolodex of similar situations and say, this experience is like this experience, and this is what I did, and this was the outcome, so this is what I need to do. And all those cues, the spatial cue, the connectiveness cue, those are embedded in our memory in a virtual world, a metaverse, just like they are in the physical world. I mean, we know the difference, but a lot of the same cues are there. So we can use that, and so we can expand our knowledge much faster than if we had to wait to have all those experiences again and again and again and again. We can have similar experiences, and if they're well designed, we can put you into a clothing factory, and then we can put you into a pen factory, then we can put you into a shirt factory, then we can put you into washing and dryer machine factory. So we can give you all these experiences really, really quickly. And the analogy that's really interesting, back in the late 90s, all these like young 20-somethings were taking the poker world by storm. So these guys have been playing poker for like 30 years. All of a sudden, this 20-something is beating him, and he's like, "How can that even be? Like, you don't have that experience. You don't know." Well, they interviewed these people, and they found out that these younger folks were playing digital poker. And with digital poker, you could have 5 hands up at one time. So you're playing, so for that 1 hour of poker, you're having 5 different hands, whereas the olden days, you had to play 1 hand for an hour until it was done. So it really accelerated that learning process. And that, so imagine leadership, imagine sales, imagine all those environments. You could accelerate that process by transporting people from one experience to the other, and then helping them generalize that experience. So that's kind of the one of the concepts that we talk about when we look at the agency, exploration, connectedness, and experience. It puts it all together, and then it also ties into, I'm not going to go into this too much, but the determination theory, right? The idea of autonomy, the idea of mastery, the idea of relatedness. So there's a lot of educational, andragogical, pedagogical, motivational, psychological elements that help make it work in certain instances. Again, I want to make sure that we don't run out and put everything into the metaverse. That's not the purpose of this particular workshop. But for certain things, to do it in that kind of
Is it me that I lost Karl, or did Karl lose everyone else?
Luke, as you said, military has been using metaverse type environments for decades. Why do they do that? Because they need a fast response. They need to understand where the bad guys are. They need to understand who they're coordinating with. They need to understand the weather. They need to, all that is possible in these types of environments. And you can't tell me that's not needed for understanding first responders, for understanding manufacturing conditions, for understanding, you know, different countries, things unfolding on the ground. I mean, all of those places can be leveraged inside for the learning experience.
I love that. And Karl, you fluctuated in and out just a little bit there. So
Okay.
let me just kind of give you gave some really good examples there. Let me give a call out to follow Karl on LinkedIn for sure, if you're interested in this type of stuff, and check out his LinkedIn courses around this. You know, what he just gave, he goes into much deeper depth where he talks about how these adult learning principles that we've talked about of the best of learning actually show up in this environment. And then they show up in very specific ways of using this environment. We've talked about things like scavenger hunts and guided tours and onboarding and orienteering, but there are like so interesting things going on, and there's so interesting ways to use metaverse thinking and metaverse environments. And then, you know, you see something new in this, and this is something I really want to call out, which is that this sense of agency, this sense of self, does not exist in Zoom. And I think we've all heard people with Zoom fatigue. We've heard people with Zoom frustration. And at the same time, we've heard people thinking how amazing it is that in the virtual world, things are more accessible than ever before. I didn't have to fly in for that workshop. And so one of our core hypotheses, one of our core theses of this is that the metaverse is one of the answers to having that accessibility. But when you do it smart, you actually can create something new. And I think that's what we did here. And I want to make sure we close up with enough time to, I see a lot of people wanted to see our campus. So I'm actually going to close us up 5 minutes early and put a link in so people can use this time if they want to do it. We'll also invite people to our campus in our Abilitie and in our Invited MBA campus through the email that comes out after this in the recording. Right. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Karl say a few final words, some few final thoughts for us to think about as we do this metaverse type thinking and thinking about it in cohort-based learning, whether it's spatial learning, like going into a molecule, whether it's process or learning, like firefighting or nursing, or whether it's community building learning, like we do at Abilitie, again, with our Invited MBA programs, with our leadership development programs. But I'm going to let him close out, give us a few final thoughts for the metaverse, how to continue to get involved with this. And then I'm going to put a link in the chat that actually invites you to come into this space. You can use the last 5-10 minutes to do it. And then I'll tell you how the recording is going. So Karl, you want to give a few words?
Yeah, great, Luke. So I mean, if I had to give any advice, I would say the first thing is go into a metaverse, even if you're uncomfortable with it, and experiment and figure out what it's all about. And keep this in mind, we're still, you know, I went to graduate school very long ago when they were talking these kind of worlds, but we're still in the nascent stage. So there's still a lot to learn. So some of the issues like, oh, there's a lag. Oh, you can't see facial expressions. Oh, you know, a keyboard and a mouse aren't, you know, hey, those are all going away. You know, 10 years ago, I would say, hey, I don't have a phone that I can fit in my pocket. Now I do. So the technology is evolving rapidly. So you don't want that to be, someone told me when the internet first came out, when you couldn't even put video on the internet because waiting it for a download was like 15, 20 minutes. They said, I don't care. You figure out how to use video on the internet. I said, why? They said, because when it hits, you'll be ready. And so when this does hit, you want to be ready and you want to be capable of doing that. And as Anna said, a lot of those can be fixed and are being fixed as those issues. So don't shy away from it because the technology is not there yet. The other thing I will say as a final word is think about what you've always wanted to do from an L&D perspective, but weren't able to do. Because repeating what, you know, sitting at a conference room or a conference table or a slideshow isn't what we want to do. What we want to do is push the learning boundaries in ways that I can't even think of right now. You might not be able to think of right now, but you're not going to get there if you don't experiment. And so experimentation leads you to the future. And I don't say like, you know, spend all your life in the metaverse, because you have to spend a little bit of it in Chat GPT and Google DeepMind, right? Because there's a lot of technologies, but
Yeah.
those will merge. And then the other thing I'd say, when you look for trends, don't look for trends of technology. Look for trends of what technology can do. And that is what, and typically it's a convergence of multiple technologies that gives us a new tool. And eventually we don't even talk about the technology. Like nobody's mentioned MP4 versus a wave in decades, right? because that's no longer an issue, but it used to be a huge issue. And in so many years, this isn't going to be an issue. We're just going to have a tool that will allow us to create this virtual experience and hit publish, and it's going to be published. And so that's going to be a really, I think, exciting future.
I love that, Karl. I think people who are innovating in this are trying out really new things, and the convergence of all these different technological, social, cultural things are changing what is possible. And I love that you're on the forefront of it, Karl, and I appreciate you coming here and joining with me. There's a lot of questions. For those of you who want more questions, you feel free to send me, connect to me on LinkedIn, connect to Karl on LinkedIn, follow his stuff. I think we're over 57,000 now. Last I saw, Karl. Not surprisingly, you're leading the conversation on this. I think it's incredible. I want to invite whoever would like to join. We have a limited number of spaces. Eventually this campus gets locked out, but if I share my screen, this is our college, this is our campus environment that we run leadership development programs on. Feel free to click on it and come on in. I have a bunch of my team waiting there. Once you show up, you'll have the opportunity to create a tiny little avatar. You can play around with it. You can use your arrow keys to move around. You can actually walk up to other people and see when your avatar walks up. If I walk up here, I can see my colleague Megan here. Looks like she's there. Looks like she's coming to her screen, but she doesn't want to show her video because she's in front of everybody. But feel free to come on in. Oh, there's Megan. Come on in, see us here. In the next couple of days, you're going to get access to a recording of this. Feel free to connect with us. Feel free to connect with us in any way you'd like. We love being on the forefront of the leadership development of the learning field. We love our partnership with CLO. A huge thank you to Stephen and his team on this one from Abilitie. We love doing these types of things and would love to do more in the future. So feel free to connect to us. Feel free to come in. Feel free to come check out our virtual space and have a wonderful... Stephen, am I forgetting something? I probably am. Oh, you're muted.
No, that's actually just about it. I do have a final note or two. So if there's one more thing you guys wanted to say to the audience, feel free to do so now.
All yours.
All right. Thank you, Luke. And thank you, Karl, as well, for taking this time out of your busy day to present all this great and valuable information with us. I know I really appreciate it. And from the looks of it, looks like the audience did as well. I would like to thank the audience also for joining in and for continuing to support our Chief Learning Officer webinars. And of course, thank you to our good friends over at Abilitie for sponsoring today's event. Be sure to check out our next webcast, this one taking place on Thursday, January 24th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. This one titled Transformative Conversations, Steps to Organizational Change. Once again, Thursday, January 24th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. This concludes today's webcast. Stay safe, everyone. Have a great day.